Hello and welcome to our session. I'm Laurenz Mahlanza-Langer. I'll give you a brief introduction. I'm sure colleagues still come from lunchtime or breakfast or dinner, so we'll start gently while the slides come up. So don't worry, we're not going to do any substantial activities in the first minute. So I do think the slides have come up, just to maybe give it another 10 seconds. This is a fishbowl session, so please feel free to participate at any time. You can leave your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll be able to pick them up in the open discussion. So we're hoping it's going to be a nice and open and interactive session. So I think, yeah, we've given colleagues some time. So let me probably get going very gently. So the title of the session is called Critical Reflections from Peers about the development and use of innovative evidence synthesis approaches, challenges and opportunities for policy uptake across context. So that is a mouthful. I think if I had to make it a bit gentler and a bit neater, it's like we really want to talk about innovation in evidence synthesis, and particular evidence synthesis for decision making. And we have a really, really nice group of people together who has heaps of experience from different contexts, from within government, from within academia, and everything in between to reflect on that. So we hope you can join us in these critical reflections. Next slide, please. Just double checking if the slides have moved forward to the second slide. Super, brilliant. So you might be wondering what PEERSS is. So here's a fairly technical definition of PEERSS. So we are the Partnership for Evidence and Equity in Responsive Social Systems. And we've set out to strengthen the use of appropriate mechanisms and to build conducive environments for advancing evidence-informed policy making, particularly in the social systems as the SDGs. And we believe in a couple of values. Our three core values are co-creation, equity, and commitment. And we bring together 13 partners across the world to work together to adapt different approaches and tools for EIPM. And that's all possible thanks to generous support by IDRC and the Hewlett Foundation. Next slide, please. So that was a technical introduction to PEERSS. Here's a slightly more social introduction. So this is a picture from our retreat a month ago in Johannesburg. So PEERSS really is a genuine partnership of 13 teams who all believe in the same idea that if we can use evidence for decision making, we can improve the world. That might sound very ambitious, but I think ethically that's really what brings the partnership together. So we do believe that through using evidence and data, we can do something about the social issues in our context. And it's a really nice group of people because we have this shared vision, these shared ethics, and we have a lot of fun together.
I'm sorry, I don't think the participants can see your slides. Sorry to interrupt you.
Oh dear,
So I'm the one sharing the slides. Yeah, is that it says they're shared. We tested this, of course.
Well, so for the participants, I think I can kind of give you a sense. You would be seeing a picture of close to 60 people smiling and laughing together, shaking hands, dancing, discussing. One person is exercising. So this is pictures from our lovely retreat. And it gives across an atmosphere of what the partnership is about, which is really that through social interactions, through relationships, that's what we think makes evidence to be useful for decision making. And so it's not so much the technical bits, the most sophisticated statistical meta-analysis or the best RCT, but much more these social interactions, and particularly these social interactions of how we as partners can learn from each other. So at a South Africa-based organization, what can I learn from Firmaye's amazing work in Ethiopia or Davi's amazing work in Brazil? And every partner brings something different to the table. And together as a partnership, we have this amazing menu of different evidence tools and approaches and ideas that we've been sharing over the last 4 years. And it's been a really, really amazing experience. And we were hoping that today we can share a little bit of that learning with you. So that would have been the slide that you saw. I hope it gives an idea. The next slide would have been to just tell you a little bit about ourselves, but in the absence of slides, I believe we can probably do that more interactively. So it is a session of a responsive partnership, and we have to be a bit responsive because one of our speakers unfortunately had an emergency. So if you had expected Bertie Snilsvit, the head of the synthesis office at PRE, to be here, unfortunately she sends her apologies. So you have Firmaye, and you've got Davi, and you've got Kavita, and you've got myself, and we'll each give you a little bit of a 2 to 3 minute pitch about one specific topic that we're interested in, and also an introduction to ourselves. And then we'll open it up for the broader group between us and also for questions to the audience. So I think that's everything from my side. And Firmaye, maybe I can hand over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laurenz. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. So I'm just going to start by introducing myself. So as Laurenz mentioned, I am Firmaye from the Ethiopian Public Health Institute. So just before going into, the specific bits of what we want to talk about today, I just want to give you a highlight of what the institute I'm working in looks like. So the name, as I mentioned, is Ethiopian Public Health Institute. It's actually an autonomous federal organization, which has been working for almost more than a century now. And mainly we're working on three main things in the country, since we are the technical wing of the Ministry of Health of Ethiopia. So mainly we work on public health research. And the second thing that we mainly focus on capacity building on related with laboratory. And the third is public health emergency management. So the specific unit that I came from is the Knowledge Translation Directorate, which I am directing now. And so this directorate has been institutionalized in Ethiopian Public Health Institute for more than 10 years. So, and in the past 10 years, we have been actually, evolving. And because of the evolution, the prior name of this unit was Research Translation and Technology Transfer. But because of, the evolution that is happening with regards to the evidence-informed decision-making space, even the name of the directorate has moved to knowledge translation to be more accommodating to the global movement and the push towards decision making using evidence. So, given the institutionalization, given the innovative tools that are upcoming in knowledge translation, I want to go back to the main critical thing that I think is really important to be discussed, which is the importance of institutionalization, because everything, at least in our setup, started for us or initiated the movement of EIDM because of the institutionalization that we had. So, having this structural setup, and especially in the governmental structure, really gave us a responsibility and also an authority and means to push the issue of EIPM, and also to be able to come up with new tools and new initiatives and strategies in order to be able to at least push into the direction of using evidence for the decision making, at least in the health sector, which we are based in right now. So when I say this, it doesn't mean that institutionalization actually breaks through all the challenges that we have, but at least it gives us a sort of a platform for us to be based on and to have some authority, as I said earlier. And some of the main challenges that we see include the level of political commitment to the tools or even the movement that we have, and also the awareness and capacity, and also the funding challenges that we encounter through all the years, even though we are more than a decade old. And I think one of the things that also relates to this is the fragmentation of EIBM. This is, of course, true, you know, globally, but also pronounced it in the national setting as well. So I think some of the things that could come into play when we talk about this fragmentation is things that would help us is one of the things that I think is partnerships like PEERSS and also global networks. And this actually goes to relate with the new tools that we're trying to introduce into the system, because it's really hard to have new tools introduced, and to have it as a single tool, not to have it as standardized and contextualized throughout different settings. And it helps to have these kinds of partnerships to share experiences, share our innovative approach, and to learn from them, to contextualize them, to validate them at the end of the day, because we are really focused on at least standardizing our tools, and also bringing them into a system within a very strong methodological capacity. So I will come back later and also focus on, I would like to focus on, especially on the standardization issue, because that is one of the things that really challenges us here. And I think it's one of the things that we should be looking forward to. But thank you. I'll come back later.
Thanks so much. I think, Davi, you're up next, right?
Thank you, Laurenz. Can you hear me well? Yep, great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation and for everyone that is attending. And well, just briefly about me and the work of the Veredas Institute. My name is Davi Romão. I'm from Brazil. I'm a psychologist by training, but I've been working in this ecosystem of evidence in foreign public policy for almost 10 years now. And together with a few colleagues, we co-founded this institute, the Veredas Institute, mostly starting from our experiences in the government, and in the government seeing the challenge, or the daily challenge of using evidence and designing good policies that could effectively change the lives of our fellow Brazilians, and seeing how much public funds were wasted because of poor policy designs and poor policy choices. So we reached out to this debate of evidence in foreign public policy mostly as an attempt to improve the Brazilian government, improve the lives of Brazilians. And we've been very fortunate to be able to participate in the growing movement of evidence in foreign public policy in Brazil. Like, this area has been growing steadily and strongly for the past few years. We work in any policy areas, and we specialize mostly in knowledge translation, so evidence synthesis, evidence reviews, deliberative dialogues, strategies to promote the use of literature inputs, and also quantitative insights to improve policymaking. And that whole process that we've been living for the last 6 years, I think has been strongly boosted by the support that we had from peers, and that has been very strategic, and it has been a privilege to be part of this movement, because we were born with this desire of changing the culture in Brazil, the culture of doing policy, the culture in policy making, not exactly with this mission of providing specific consultancy inputs or like a report, but mostly changing behaviors, changing norms, and changing how organizations institutionalize the use of evidence. And I think PEERSS has helped us to foster the necessary connections for that to happen, because basically for this to happen, we really need a network of people. We need a coalition. We need multiple actors working on the topic simultaneously, and sharing a view, sharing tools, sharing an understanding that this is necessary and this is instrumental for better policies to be done and to be effective. So through the partnership via PEERSS, we've been able to fund, create, and champion this coalition in Brazil, the Coalition for Evidence, the Brazilian Coalition for Evidence, which puts together several people from different policy areas, researchers, policymakers, technical staff, NGO representatives that are interested in the debate of evidence in foreign public policy, and that have been supporting each other and channeling energy into this coalition in a way that expands our capacity, leverage our capacity to influence our local context. So this has been very powerful. And a similar movement, but at the Latin American level, so the evidence, Latin American Caribbean Evidence Hub, which also tries to do that at regional level, right? So I think these two initiatives have been very special, because already touching a bit on the topic of our conversation today, capacity building or institutionalizing evidence use and like innovative evidence synthesis approach. For all that to happen, we really need systems change, right? We need several people that basically doing policy requires many stakeholders, many authorizers to be on board. If like you only have 1, 2, 3 people that are advocating for a policy, that it will never happen. You need a coalition around it. So we really need to invest in these strong networks that can support evidence use. And that just, for instance, I think 2 examples that were born out of these partnerships. One is we've been offering for 2 years now very introductory course on evidence use for different stakeholders in Brazil. This year, we are just finishing the 2nd edition that was targeting at vulnerable populations, so people that have a hard time accessing the labor market in Brazil, and we were basically trying to train them so that they can become staff members or they can become professionals in this area. This is really important for us, both in terms of maximizing the diversity within the field. Unfortunately, Brazil has a very big social/racial divide. So this type of effort is necessary to increase diversity in the area. And also as a strategy to just promote more jobs and to, of course, improve the policies that we are involved with. And another initiative that was coupled with this one was the creation of fully accessible videos that were supporting the course and that were adjusted so that people with different disadvantaged backgrounds or disabilities, they could understand what we were saying, so that we can train multiple stakeholders, including citizens, to understand a bit the basics of this debate and become more informed and hopefully stronger citizens and participants in the public life. So that's just a teaser of what we've been up to.
Sounds like more than one piece, to be honest, and yeah, absolutely amazing. Yeah, so I think so. From South Africa, and then probably Kavita, we can come to you. I mean, just to pick up on a few items. So Davi, I completely agree. So when you say networks and hubs, so our slogan is that only together can evidence-informed decision-making become a reality. So I think we've learned exactly the same lesson, that if you want culture change for evidence use, we want systems level change, then we need to work in coalitions of organizations, individuals, and so forth. And so this power of relationships, partnerships, and networks, I think it mirrors exactly our experience here. And that's why I think it's such a nice partnership to be part of with PEERSS. And also to your point, Firmaye, I think institutionalization, that's exactly like, definitely very hot political potato in the South African evidence ecosystem, to where we have government itself asking for institutionalization. But then what does it mean in practice? So I think that's where we currently need a bit of help and cross-learning, particularly from your context, seeing how long EPHI has worked in this space. So, at what point, like, what does institutionalization look like? So in our context, we have a national department that governs evidence use. But if that doesn't trickle down to provincial and local level where implementation happens, is that institutionalization, or are we just at a point where we have institutionalized talking about evidence for policy design, but not for implementation? So just a few questions that just from our context that ring very true. And then maybe one angle to the discussion that I would add from the South Africa Center for Evidence, where I'm based, which is an NGO that's trying to support evidence use. So very similar to colleagues, and we look very keenly always to Veredas to see how, as an NGO, you've set up your systems. But so we're thinking quite a bit around, well, how do you measure evidence use, and what is the evidence base for different approaches to support evidence use? And it sometimes feels like we are not practicing what we preach. So we tell other people to use evidence, but then are we actually evidence-based ourselves? So if I design a new training program for decision makers, is that evidence-based? Is that informed by the latest evidence on, for example, entropy and other adult learning theories? Or am I just doing what I've always done with my slides? And then if we get funding to support the use of evidence, what are our measures for evidence use? And if we don't have measures, maybe how do we know that we've actually made a difference and can substantiate that the use of evidence actually leads to poverty reductions? So yeah, so this question on like, how do we know that evidence use makes a difference and how do you measure that? That's something that we're quite interested in and would be curious to hear if other colleagues are grappling with similar issues. So yes, that's the contribution from Johannesburg. Maybe Kavita, we can come to you.
Sure. Thanks, Laurenz. So definitely, excited to be here. And I think there are already so many issues and topics here bubbling up just from, these introductions and understanding the different contexts in which your organizations are based. From our side, so my name is Kavita Hatipoglu, and I'm a senior program officer with R4D. And we've had the privilege of serving as the coordinating organization for the PEERSS network. And so, we're facilitating and supporting this network of diverse partners. And so I think from that lens, and in this partnership and across many of our other activities, we're looking at this from the sort of collaborative learning aspect as well, in education and health and in this multi-sectoral activity. Really thinking about how do we better facilitate sort of this cross-sharing of experience and this cross-fertilization, so that research institutions in diverse parts of the world and in different parts of the system can more effectively learn from one another. And I think for this conversation, I think is particularly interesting, as we think about some of these newer approaches to evidence use. What are the ways that networks like ours can support the further development or refinement of an application of some of these tools, and what is needed, across organizations to understand and use those. And then thinking about too, at the sort of more macro level, the 3 IEs, how do partners effectively engage with those sort of global organizations who can provide sort of some of the efficiencies and some of the I guess what other sort of resources and types of services can those organizations provide that can support many of you and as national actors engaged in day-to-day knowledge translation activities. So I think those are some of the topics that we're interested in also in further exploring in this conversation.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. And it's definitely, we have, I guess, a lot to choose from where we would want to start. I also see we've got questions from the audience, which is lovely. I think, let me just make sure I'm not losing it. It's around institutionalization of evidence-informed decision-making. How does that look like in different contexts? Does it follow the same path? So thank you, Andile, for that question. And also, Laura, hello, is also emphasizing the point around institutionalization of evidence-informed decision-making. It's a shared challenge in Brazil. So I wonder if we have 2 points on institutionalization, it's a big word, coming from the audience. Should we maybe start there? And I think, Firmaye, that was something that came up from your initial pitch. So maybe do you want to start responding a little bit to these questions and then see how we can help with our experiences from our contexts?
Yeah, I think it's important, as you say, to reflect on the institutionalization in different contexts, because we say institutionalization just as a word, but it might mean different things in different places. So just to give you a background of how we got to be institutionalized and how we actually leveraged that to go into the system. So actually, the institutionalization of the knowledge translation unit at EPHI was not very well planned at first, because it just came because of a renovation, or if I'm sure you have heard about the BPR, or the business process re-engineering of the health sector as a whole, was a movement in Ethiopia. So there were needs to transfer technology, national technologies into an actual products in the country. So it was the initiation of the institutionalization of the knowledge translation unit. But as the environment and the global environment evolved, we came into the work of EIPM. But even then, I cannot say that by mentioning that we are institutionalized. The fact is that we have we do not have a clear structure to the level of the regional levels, where, as you said, Laurenz, decision is actually made. So we have this institutionalized sections at the ministry that accept some of the evidence that we produce. And also we are, as I said earlier, we are the technical wing of the Ministry of Health. So we work on evidence synthesis in order to provide the ministry with evidence for decision making. But again, there are so many challenges with even the acceptance of the evidence that we produce. And sometimes it might help, I think, with your setting, Laurenz, you might, comment on this later, but I think you have a better setup to provide decisions or evidence to decision directly. But we have to, because of our setup, we are in the EPHI, which is a technical wing, but we have to go through different, authorities to present our evidence for decision making, even to put it on a table of a decision maker. So usually what we do is, even though we're institutionalized, we fall back on our informal communications that we have with different individuals and decision makers. And I think it's really critical at this point, at least, to recognize the importance of identifying some of champions in different organizations that are usually hidden opinion leaders, we can call them, that have a very long hands or influence, even though they are not recognized in the structure. So we usually fall back on those kinds of influences in order to help us, push forward the issue of evidence-informed decision-making and to make the institutionalization that is, structurally recognized to be influential at the same time. So it is also, interesting to see that Brazil, as we have heard from Davi and also Laura, that they are also share, the problem of this institutionalization of EIPM to have, a system level impact. So one of the things I think, as an understanding is to have a sort of a culture of evidence use for decision making. But I think to reach to that level of a culture of using evidence, I think it's important to take some baby steps of, having a legitimized evidence used, or to make evidence use as a mandate for our decision makers. I think this could be one of the things that we can look forward to or work towards. But again, to reach to that level, it needs, as I said earlier, political uptake and political interest in the area of EIPM. And so, so I think this, capacity building of both the researchers and our decision makers is also something that would help into making this pseudo institutionalizations into a very influential, true, influential, structures. So yeah.
Thanks. Now, can I ask one follow-up question very quickly? Sorry, my apologies. So, I'm really curious. So, because you're within government, right? And so you're telling this really amazing story how the institutionalization has happened. So, what advice would you give organizations like Davi's and myself, who are placed outside of government? Like, what would your advice be to us? How can we support institutionalization? Because it's almost like we have to work via you to some extent. But I don't know, what would your advice be to Davi and me for our organizations in that context?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a tricky question, really. But, from my perspective and the experience that I have, I think having an institutionalization within the government has its own perks and also its own disadvantages. So I think we can benefit from having institutionalized units, both like yourselves out of the government and also within. But I think it's really important to have both of them, because having, an institutionalization within the government gives you a sort of advantage in having easier access and identifying some of the really policy questions to be responded to, and easy access to our decision makers, which is really important, and influence. So whenever you are in a governmental structure, it gives you a sort of authority to have a longer or a more influential authority over the decision makings or over the questions that should be responded to. But at the same time, there is, this understanding of disadvantage where you are within a governmental organization. There is a higher chance of you being influenced by the decision makers. For instance, in our case, as you know, we have a single party system. So sometimes, even though you have evidence within a certain issue, it might be really hard for us to say, things that are really against the needs of that party. This is just an example. So if you have, another organization or a unit that is outside of the influence of the government, that would give you a sort of an advantage to have a more free and, scientifically an evidence that is scientifically, which has a scientific integrity, so that we can use like the advantages of both. But I think it's really important to have both the out of the government and within government. Yeah, but I think it's still important to push forward to have a structure within the government, despite all the problems, despite all the influences that this unit might have. It is usually influential or an easier gateway towards the decision making influence. I hope I have responded just a little.
Could I jump in and? Yeah. I think from the perspective of Brazil, this is a very interesting question because I think a few years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, we had the debate around evidence-informed public policy basically being hosted by the first adopters. So people who were leading this debate and they were falling in love with it and they were really seeing the meaning and the potential of it, but it would still be something very pretty much outside the institutions, right? So it's like individuals that were the kind of leading the whole thing. And now we're getting to the point where institutions are catching up with it, not fully, not in a great way, but I mean, not completely, but it's happening, it's slowly happening. And we are at this turning point where before we were basically building capacity for a few organizations to be able to provide rapid responses, to be able to synthesize evidence whenever possible, and kind of building the sensibilization around the topic so that key decision makers would be aware of it and be able to recognize the need of it, even though it wasn't a priority. And now it is slowly becoming more like a topic of the day. And the demand for evidence is growing. So we've recently had conversations with the Ministry of Health, with the Ministry of Finance in Brazil, both interested in strengthening the use of evidence. And so that built-in capacity that we had around the ecosystem of evidence, basically researchers mostly, that are training themselves and their staff and their supervisees into evidence review, literature review, and analysis for policy. That is like a capacity that we have that can now be tapped on by these new stakeholders that are coming in and seeing the value of this. And I think the whole debate is now migrating from how do we do this evidence synthesis and how do we apply evidence in policy, in the policy context, more to, okay, we do want this to happen in a more systematic way, and we need to change our institutions so that our institutions are able to absorb this debate, incorporate it, and to make it like a key part of it. So now the debate around evidence use is migrating from a more technical perspective, how to promote, to produce, and synthesize evidence, to a more political sciencey debate on how do we develop institutional change. And that's kind of new for us as evidence brokers, right? Because we're used to just do like the review on what works best for anemia or what works best for this, I don't know, reducing crime. And now we're like, okay, how do I change my organization? What are the protocols, what are the strategies I can adopt so that the Ministry of Economics, the Ministry of Finance can improve its uptake of evidence throughout the whole system? And that's where the institutionalization question shines, right? That's why this is such a great moment to be talking about it here. And then I think there's strategies such as having an evidence unit, a specialized unit that will be able to meet the demand from the organization, having protocols, having this, maybe a law regulation that requires evidence use, having trainings available for staff, for key stakeholders around the policymaking process is super critical. and so on. Like we could list a few strategies that are already part of our toolkit of evidence-informed public policy, but now we need to tailor them in a way that they are supportive of institutional change.
And can I add on a question there for all of you? I think I see the need and the role that you can play in creating this sort of institutionalization and affecting the system change. But is that your mandate? I'm just curious in terms of, it requires a different skill set, right? And so how are you navigating that? I think is it the individual institutions that responsibility falls to? Is it amongst these sort of broader coalitions? Or how does that interact with even the Campbells and the 3 IEs, or the sort of broader architecture?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Is it?
I don't know the answer. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I give you 30 seconds pitch, and then others will come in. So I can tell you of a situation where I wasn't sure it was my mandate, but it just happened. So we were at one point asked to write a guideline for decision makers on how to use evidence. You know, it was kind of an appendix to a chapter that we wrote, and we submitted that. And then 2 years later, suddenly a cabinet meeting happened, and that guideline became official policy directive, and every decision maker had to follow it. And that's not mind. So I'm not sure I would have been comfortable with that mandate. But I think that is, to your question, it's a really good. I think you're spot on there. Is this our mandate as individual institutions? So sometimes I'm a bit uneasy in it, but I'm not sure. How do you feel, Davi and Firmaye?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So I'm going to talk about a recent experience that we had. So one of the tools that we work on is health technology assessment. So in Ethiopia, this health technology assessment is conducted in different organizations, but unfortunately, we do not have a structure that is centrally controlling that. But it's really critical to have, since health technology assessment really guides priority setting in the country, it's really important to have a sort of organization that at least overlooks it. So even though we do not have, the mandate to institutionalize this, one of the things that we can do is provide technical support and also show the importance and the gap that is present. So what we did was have or conduct a national situational analysis, and it clearly showed the problem that we had. So based off of that situational analysis, we are now working on a roadmap to institutionalize HT in Ethiopia. So even though we are not going to be, a direct mandated organization to institutionalize these kinds of important structures, we can be the force that is, pushing forward and showing the gap and advocating for it. So this is one of the ways I think we can, input into institutionalization.
Yeah, maybe well, that's great for me. And in Brazil, that is definitely part of the mandate of the organization, because the organization was born to promote the culture of evidence use in Brazil. So institutionalization is a key part of it. It hasn't been, though, a key part of our products and services, because as an organization that lives from funding, we need to respond to the funders' needs and priorities, right? So we have mostly been working with evidence synthesis and literature review and like qualitative analysis of data analysis for policy decision. So the funding has moved us towards that direction, and now this new wave of interest is slightly moving us towards the capacity building institutionalization debate. And the way we've been reacting to it, like it's still first steps, but for instance, internally we've been conducting a course on adaptive management, so that our staff understands how a policymaking process is done, the reality of it, and what are the key shortcuts or strategies or pathways that a policymaker can take to develop institutional reform and new policy, design new policies and implement new policies. And the idea for us that this could be a springboard towards some kind of external course or external services that supports policymakers in absorbing this technology, these techniques into their own practice, while they're using evidence from what we already have as evidence synthesis and other evidence products, right? And we are also in conversation with another partner of ours that is especially interested in productive inclusion, social inclusion through work, employment, and wage income. And they already have like a good sense of what's the evidence on the debate, but they want the government, the state, to be able to implement that evidence and to turn this evidence into good policies. So in conversation with them, we're also starting to debate, okay, how do we do structural change? How do we induce capacity development within public organizations? And that might become a new project soon, hopefully. So we're slowly moving towards that debate, and we're slowly building internal capacity and skills to be able to provide, and that's again evidence informed. So we're doing our own reviews and like studying the topic a bit to be able to talk about it. But it's a new area, right? We really need to develop new skills. One, just maybe we could add to the discussion the question that Vivian has asked from Campo a while ago on what would be useful ways to use like their systematic reviews, for instance, and make it more user-friendly and usable. Just bringing this to the mix.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to speak over anybody. Yeah, I think I'll come to Vivian's question. I think it's nice to go there, but maybe just picking up very quickly, Davi, so it's striking, we're in a very similar position that the funding is certainly structured much differently from this systemic good governance work. Like when we pitch this to a funder, the question is very often, well, but what sector is it in? Is this in education? Is this in health? Is it in social protection? It's like, no, it's across everything. Then it doesn't align well. And I also completely agree with you. We need to build new skills ourselves because it's an area we haven't worked in. And I think one reflection, I think that might lead me to Vivian's question is, like, sometimes, to be honest, we have struggled with this mandate, and that is in context where the governance systems themselves are not yet ready to use evidence. So if I go work at local level and I'm dealing with decision makers who have issues such as there's no electricity or no working computer, it is tough to have a course or capacity building on how to search for evidence, how to appraise evidence, and to get those guidelines. And so sometimes it feels a little bit there's a disconnect with this mandate at a fairly aggregate level, and then the realities of decision makers at the ground. And then I'm feeling not so comfortable in that mandate, to be honest. And maybe this can lead me a little bit to Vivian's question, because I do think there's this inherent challenge that I think, Kavita, you mentioned between the global and the local, or in our context, the national and the local. And I think you always need both. That would be my quick question to Vivian. So you do need the global systematic reviews. Our knowledge base starts there. And then we probably always have to complement them with the local reality. So even oftentimes in our own world, the national evidence itself is not enough. People want actually broken down, ideally by province, ideally by district. So it's always a request that we get. So how can we make Campbell reviews more useful? Or I think in any evidence tool, to be honest, I think if the tools become through a few measures that I think we can discuss more, like technology, if they become more all-encompassing of bridging this divide from the global to the local or the national to the local, that would be my personal hunch that we can make more progress there. So yeah, so that was my reflection, and maybe I can hand it back to the group. I don't know, Kavita, if you want to come back in on the initial question.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just picking up on that point of sort of sustainability and this push-pull of where funding comes from versus what you think is going to support sort of the field and building this architecture. So I guess it does come back to, and for Campbell and for the other three IEs, that produce these global public goods too. I think we've had the experience within, R4D and within other activities too, that global public goods are extremely useful, and they're efficient with some of the resources. And to Laurenz's point, you can adapt them and further break them down. But they're hard to generate funding for, because they're not responding again to that. Well, this is my one sector need. This responds to my one policy question. You know, this is a general global public good. So I guess I wonder, for all of you, I guess, how do you address that sustainability? What does sustainability look like for your organizations, and how do you consider that, you know, also in taking on and developing capacity for newer approaches and methodologies that maybe you think are going to be later on, or that you think are useful, but maybe there's not immediate demand for an immediate opportunity to fund and resource both the capacity development side of it, as well as the products themselves.
Yeah, so let me just, it's one of the main challenges that we have, because as you know, EIPM, as you said, is a very wide area, but at the same time very important and efficient on the other side. But again, even nationally, it is really hard to gain interest, especially for funding, since it is a very wide, and most of our funders and organizations would like to just focus on a single area. So I think sometimes it is important to, while we're pushing for the recognition of EIPM and the wideness of it, it is also important to be realistic and navigate the global interest. So I think there are, even though they are so specific in certain areas, there are opportunities that we can tap into with specific initiatives, and bringing, trying to mold some of our works within the interest of our funders, but also at the same time not leaving the base of EIPM. So I think we should somehow, the further discussion could be how to navigate this global interests, and how to use the already available platforms for our advantage. So sometimes, you have, until it becomes really relevant and it becomes very accepted without any question, we have to somehow fit into the available opportunity. And I think here we have to also, especially with the innovative tools that we have, I want to mention the importance of standardization that I mentioned earlier. So one of the things, I think this might also touch up a little bit on the Vivian's question. So one of the main challenges that we face, especially with providing these tools to our decision makers, is the lack of standardization. And as I said, we have very fragmented and different organizations that work on EIPM space. And for instance, we use one of the products that we use is Policy Brief. But one of the challenges is that we have 10 organizations that work or that produce policy briefs, but all the policy briefs are really different. The format is different, the aim is different. So I think it's really important to bring this kinds of tools into the standardization that systematic review, for instance, has. So even though systematic review is a sort of a very technical product, it is very well accepted. When you present findings from a systematic review, you're not going to be asked, about this systematic review. You just have to discuss about the product. So I think one of the things that are coming up now, for instance, we have plain language summaries from systematic reviews, which makes it easier for policymakers and the publics to use. So I think we should also work for this kinds of rapid reviews, policy briefs, and every innovative tools that we bring about to be going into standardization that can be contextualized into different settings. I think that could be one of the way forwards. Yeah.
I fully agree with that, just very briefly, because without standardization, and obviously acknowledging there's pitfalls to anything, it's really difficult to learn from each other. Because if you might be running a beautiful mentoring program in Ethiopia for evidence use, and somebody else might be a similar program in Cameroon, but if we use very different language and package it very differently, we might not even know about the synergies. So if one person calls it secondment, the other person calls it mentoring, the next person calls it continued professional development. But if essentially, we are trying out similar mechanisms and tools, but there's no standardization in it. It's really tricky for us to be aware of it and learn from each other. So I'd fully agree with that point.
Yeah, I was thinking while based on Vivian's question and while Firmaye was sharing about her experience, I think well, first of all, these global public goods, they are critical. They are such important resources, right? They save so much time and effort. And we do need, like the demand for evidence products is increasing. And for us to meet the demand, it's strategic that we lower the cost of producing. So that the supply needs to be cheap. And these global products, they allow it to be much cheaper than if we had to produce it all in-house every time that we need to reply to answer to demand. But then there is a challenge there because evidence is being produced so rapidly. So products, they get outdated very quickly. Nowadays, if we find a 2018 a systematic review, I honestly feel uncomfortable using it before checking that there is no better evidence that has been recently published. And also, the questions, they are very different, right? Depending on the context. So sometimes using these public goods is limited. You can only have it to a limited extent. So I was thinking to what extent we could try to really brainstorming here together. We could try to coordinate this ecosystem that works on evidence-informed public policy to pitch in effort so that these public goods, they become more robust and they become living evidence products. In a way that, I don't know, in like data analysis, you have this this revolutionary technology, which was instead of processing the data in one computer, you distribute all the data across several computers, and that has multiplied 1,000-fold your capacity of processing data for like very complex problems. We have that today happening, right? So we have thousands of people screening papers every day using very similar technique, very similar level of competence, and that's like replicating the same work. It's just redundant work. And if we're able to do that in a coordinated manner, we could save so much time and money, and like use these efforts to fit into some global public goods, such as like living evidence gap maps that are cross-cutting across different policy areas or specialized in a policy area. I don't know, so maybe answering Vivian's question, maybe that could be an interesting thought on how to optimize all that energy and resources that we're putting into building these resources into something that can be easily usable for all the actors in the ecosystem.
Yeah, so I think with what Davi just said and also what Laurenz has, reflected, I think this is where we see, the very unique role of partnerships like PEERSS, because it's really hard to get in touch with or share experience from the global players on this space if you don't have such platforms. So I think whether it is for standardization or whether it is to leverage from the technologies that we have these days, I think it's important to have this kinds of platforms to bring in together the different experiences and expertise that we have out there and the different organizations that we have out there. So I think it's a very unique opportunity to use this kinds of networks and partnerships. Yeah.
I'd be very curious to hear from the coordinating organization, the representative of the coordinating organization about the coordination space. What do you think, Kavita?
Well, I think it's it's interesting. I don't know. I think the coordination space is also hard because of so many of the constraints that you face, right? If we see the value of shared and peer learning and being able to explore, here are the challenges that we're facing, but when you're talking about funding or it's hard to generate funding for processes, right? A lot of times there are sort of clear outputs or deliverables. And if you don't have a sense of, oh, here's where we will be at the end of the day, it can be hard to generate resources for. And so I think that's just one thing in terms of thinking about like networks. Is it the more organic sort of across all areas types of networks like PEERSS has been, or is it organized around more specific issues, or are there like working groups around specific issues like the standardization? And how do you strike that balance, I think is something that continues to be a point of conversation as well.
Yeah, and I also think that it's really critical to recognize that, the area that we're talking about is not only related with evidence, it's more of a political environment. And it's really important to navigate that area and understand it and, work towards, influencing through understanding all the areas that influence decision making. And I think that is one of the things that makes this area tricky too.
Yeah. I come back to another activity. We heard a former policymaker say that, policy making is decision making under duress, that they're being pulled in all of these different directions too. And I guess as we're coming up on a wrap up here too, I just wonder if you have quick responses about how some of these, living syntheses or evidence gap maps maybe can alleviate some of that duress, or if, yeah. And then Davi, maybe closing remarks.
I mean, if they were there, right? Absolutely, they could. I mean, we had situations where we were at conferences with advisors to ministers, and we had a couple of glasses of wine already, and then suddenly an SMS comes. So, what should we do about the latest X, Y, Z? And a decision will be made for better or for worse, right? So you do, in your maybe not ideal state, then do rapidly look at the evidence and try to give some response. And in situations like that, I think having a pre-curated living evidence base, more inclusive than nothing, to be honest, on what currently is being produced at a global level. So also, I think there's a bit of a gap there if we're only sticking to impact evaluations, particularly. I do think we're missing quite a bit. An inclusive evidence base at a global level, pre-assured, pre-quality appraised, etc., would be a massive, massive advantage in such situations from our perspective.
Yeah, just maybe to add one point on what Lauren said, especially with the making our tools usable for our decision makers. I think it should be a sort of flexible to consider their needs to. What I mean by that is, for instance, one of the tools that we produce previously did not include recommendations in them because we wanted to provide the decision maker to have the liberty of looking at the evidence and decide for themselves. But as we go along, one of the interests of the decision makers was, so what should I do? Recommend something. So we have to be somehow, as I said earlier, keeping the scientific integrity, but also trying to respond to some of their needs is also important. Yeah.
Well, maybe I can start the final remarks. We have 2 minutes to end. I think to question, I think probably yes, it would help, but it would maybe help just to map better the different vectors and how to deal with them, not necessarily reduce the tension that the decision maker is living through. In any case, just to wrap up our conversation today, I think it has been super rich and a delight. Thank you so much for everyone that participated and everyone that followed us. I think we leave this conversation with a few key takeaways, such as the importance. Well, first, I think this debate is now gravitating a bit towards the debate around institutionalization and how to build internal capacity, institutional capacity, state capacity for evidence use, which means exactly how can we use evidence in real world context and how can we shape organizations in a way that evidence is part of the routine, part of the protocol, part of the habit and the culture of policymaking, which is great. I think this is a super important moment for organizations to go through, and we are slowly building knowledge and capacity for doing that. We have talked a bit about the importance of networks and coalitions to do that, because this is a collective process. No single person organization alone will be able to do it. And that's the reason why we really need to build coalitions, a connection of people, movement that can foster this debate and provide opportunities, inputs for evidence use. And we also talked a bit about the importance of public goods, the challenge of funding them, but also how they can play a key role in informing local action. So they should be definitely be more funded and improved. And for that, maybe standardization of the products can be helpful so that everyone knows where to find what and what's the quality, what is exactly the information that is being provided. I think that's a very short wrap up. Thank you so much. Not sure if Laurenz wants to close the session.
No, I think that was very rapid, right? Just on time. So all good from my side. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. It was great.
Okay, everyone.
Bye.
Chat soon.